The Great Famine of 1315 was a disaster that changed the course of medieval history, causing widespread suffering across Europe. It lasted for several years and had consequences that rippled through societies, affecting everything from politics to cultural practices. Imagine a time when crops failed, food became scarce, and the climate turned against the people. This was the reality of the Great Famine. The disaster didn't just happen overnight, and its causes were a complex mix of natural and social factors. Before the famine struck, Europe had already been experiencing some tough years. The period leading up to 1315 was marked by a series of harsh winters and cool summers. These unusual weather patterns created an unstable environment for farming, which was the backbone of life during the Middle Ages. Crops weren't growing as they should, and people began to notice the changes in the land. In addition to the cold weather, there were also heavy rains, which flooded fields and ruined what little crop growth had managed to survive. As a result, food became scarce and people started to worry. But these environmental factors were just the beginning. The people of medieval Europe lived in a society where food was a central part of the economy, and most people were dependent on farming. With crops failing year after year, the pressure on the agricultural system grew, making the situation even worse. The people, already struggling from a difficult climate, had to face even more hardship as the food supply dwindled. People relied on the land for their survival, and with the land not providing, they were left in a desperate position. Entire communities found themselves facing a growing food shortage. This wasn't just a problem for the poor peasants. The impact of the famine spread through all levels of society. As people started to feel the effects of the crop failures, social tensions began to rise. The rich and the poor were both affected, but in different ways. The wealthier people could still afford to buy food, but as food prices soared, it became harder and harder to maintain the same standard of living. The poor, who relied on their own crops, had nothing to fall back on. They were the most vulnerable. People were forced to abandon their homes in search of food, leading to a massive migration of people across Europe. As the famine dragged on, it became clear that it wasn't just a temporary setback. People were dying of hunger, and with malnutrition weakening their bodies, diseases spread quickly. The lack of proper medical knowledge and resources meant that many of those who became ill didn't stand a chance. Communities were devastated by the loss of life, and the social order began to break down. It wasn't just a crisis of food, it was a crisis of survival. And as people searched for answers, there was no clear solution to their suffering. It was a period of uncertainty and fear, and many began to look for someone or something to blame. The impact of the famine would go on to shape the course of European history. It was more than just a food crisis, it was a turning point. Society was forced to adapt to a new reality where nothing was guaranteed. This was the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315, an event that would change everything. And as we dive deeper into this story, we'll explore what happened, why it happened, and how it changed the world forever. The Great Famine of 1315 did not just end with the failures of crops or the hunger that followed. The crisis went on to reveal the deep flaws in medieval society, exposing how fragile everything really was. The effects of the famine began to spread far beyond food shortages, influencing the social, political, and economic systems of the time. As the famine worsened, Europe found itself in a state of chaos, struggling to maintain a sense of order and stability. The impact on the population was devastating, and the shockwaves would continue to be felt for years to come. By the time the famine reached its peak, agriculture had been severely disrupted. Fields that once produced bountiful harvests now lay empty or flooded. Even the most successful farmers couldn't escape the destruction. The lack of grain and other basic food sources meant that people were struggling to feed themselves and their families. And the food that could be found was incredibly expensive, pushing the poor further into poverty while widening the gap between the rich and the rest of society. Many landowners were forced to raise the prices of their goods just to cover their losses, creating a perfect storm of economic instability. In the face of this, the nobility and the ruling classes were also not spared. The medieval social system was rigid, and even the wealthy were dependent on a steady flow of food to maintain their position. With their supplies running low, tensions between the wealthy landowners and the lower classes escalated. Some of the nobility began to raise taxes to compensate for their losses, making it even harder for peasants to survive. In some areas, local rebellions broke out as desperate peasants fought for their right to food, seeing no other option but to take a stand. As the famine stretched on, it became clear that there was no easy solution to the crisis. The poor harvests were not only caused by bad weather, but were compounded by the lack of proper farming techniques and resources. Most of Europe's population still relied on outdated agricultural methods, and the social structure kept many people from accessing the tools and knowledge needed to deal with changing environmental conditions. The farmers who were struggling the most didn't have the luxury of experimenting with new methods or crops. They had to make do with what they had, and what they had was not enough. This situation left the most vulnerable people exposed to the harshest consequences. With food in short supply, many of the poorer classes turned to desperate measures. In some cases, communities began to forage for wild plants or even resorted to eating animals they would normally never consider. This, however, wasn't a permanent solution. These alternative food sources didn't provide the necessary nutrition to sustain life for long, and the lack of food and poor diet weakened people's immune systems, leaving them vulnerable to disease. Disease, which had always been a threat, became an even greater danger during the famine. The weakened population was now an ideal breeding ground for illness. Plague outbreaks were common during this period, and they spread more easily due to the malnutrition and overcrowding that came with the famine. People began dying from diseases like dysentery and typhus, in addition to hunger. It's believed that the famine's death toll was made even worse by these diseases, which killed thousands more who were already weakened by lack of food. Social and cultural upheaval also marked the Great Famine of 1315. The constant struggle for survival led many people to turn to their faith, seeking solace in religion. Churches were filled as people prayed for an end to the famine. Some saw the famine as a punishment, believing that it was the result of their sins or divine wrath. Others looked to religious leaders for guidance, but even they were not immune from the suffering. Church leaders were also dealing with dwindling resources, and many were forced to close their doors to the needy. This led to an erosion of trust in the church as people began to question why the divine had allowed such suffering to take place. While many turned to religion for answers, some saw the famine as evidence of deeper systemic problems within medieval society. The rigid class structures, poor governance, and failure to adapt to changing environmental conditions all contributed to the scale of the disaster. The nobility's inability to respond effectively to the needs of their people further fueled dissatisfaction. People were beginning to realize just how interconnected everything was. The breakdown of the agricultural system didn't just affect food, it caused a domino effect that touched every aspect of life, from the economy to religion to the very fabric of society itself. As we continue to explore this dark chapter in history, it's important to understand that the Great Famine wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a reflection of a world that was unprepared for the challenges of its time. The problems it exposed would continue to reverberate throughout Europe for years to come, shaping the course of history in ways that were yet to be seen. The Great Famine of 1315 was not just a crisis. It was a turning point in medieval history, one that showed just how fragile human society really was. And as we move forward, we'll see how these events continued to unfold and what long-lasting effects they had on Europe and beyond. As the Great Famine of 1315 continued to wreak havoc on Europe, it became clear that the catastrophe wasn't just an isolated event. The effects were deeply intertwined with the environmental, social, and economic systems that defined medieval life. While the famine's immediate impact was felt in the loss of food, the long-term effects began to emerge in the form of lasting social changes, economic disruption, and shifts in the balance of power. The consequences would go far beyond the crops that failed, shaping the future of Europe in ways that were difficult to predict. One of the major shifts that resulted from the Great Famine was the movement of people. As the famine persisted, many people in rural areas were forced to abandon their homes in search of food, shelter, or better opportunities in cities. This created a massive migration of people, and for the first time, large numbers of people who were once tied to the land began to seek refuge in urban centers. Cities, which had already been struggling with overcrowding, now found themselves overwhelmed with the influx of people. This sudden increase in population put immense pressure on resources, further exacerbating the food shortages and leading to even more social unrest. The cities themselves, however, weren't much better off. As agriculture failed, trade routes were disrupted, and towns that relied on rural supplies found themselves with empty markets. Urban populations were also hit hard by the famine, with many people now forced to rely on what little could be found in the cities. Prices for food soared to unattainable heights, and as wealth became increasingly concentrated in the hands of those who controlled the remaining food supplies, tensions rose between the wealthy and the impoverished. The rising cost of food, combined with the scarcity of work, led to social unrest in the cities, and some urban areas saw outbreaks of riots and violence. In some cases, desperate citizens took to the streets to protest their conditions, demanding that the ruling classes address the crisis. But despite their protests, little help came. The famine's economic impact also extended far beyond the immediate consequences of crop failures. The collapse of the agricultural system sent shockwaves through the medieval economy, which was primarily dependent on farming. The agricultural losses not only affected the food supply, but also devastated the trade in agricultural goods. Landlords, unable to produce the crops they relied on, began to struggle financially. Many were forced to borrow money from local moneylenders, and with debts piling up, some landowners were unable to keep up with their obligations. This led to the bankruptcy of several large estates, creating a ripple effect that affected the entire economy. Trade networks that were vital for the distribution of food and goods across Europe were also hit hard. The famine disrupted transportation routes, making it difficult for food to reach its destination. Merchants who once thrived in the movement of goods found their markets drying up, and many traders found themselves unable to pay their workers or keep their businesses afloat. Without the necessary food and goods flowing through the region, many people found themselves in desperate situations, forced to take whatever jobs they could, often at reduced wages or under deplorable conditions. The ripple effects of these economic disruptions lasted long after the famine ended, contributing to further instability in the years that followed. The devastating environmental changes that were occurring during this time were also central to the ongoing crisis. The Little Ice Age, which began around the turn of the 14th century, was a period of colder temperatures and extreme weather. This global cooling affected Europe in particular, and the consequences were felt in every corner of the continent. Cool summers, harsh winters, and excessive rainfall led to poor harvests and crop failures, which were further compounded by the lack of effective farming techniques. Without the ability to grow enough food, entire communities were left vulnerable to the ravages of famine. These climatic conditions didn't just affect crops, but also the animals that people relied on for food and labor. Livestock also suffered during this period, with many animals dying from diseases that spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the time. This had a further impact on the food supply, leaving people with even fewer resources to survive. One of the key factors that made the famine so devastating was the lack of understanding about the climate and its changes. Medieval society had no concept of climate change in the way we do today, and the people living through the Great Famine were left struggling to comprehend what was happening. There were no modern scientific tools to predict weather patterns, and the knowledge needed to adapt to such drastic changes simply didn't exist. This lack of knowledge meant that communities were largely unable to prepare for the drastic environmental shifts, and when the climate began to turn, there was no way for people to adjust. As a result, the impact of the famine was much more severe than it would have been had there been greater awareness and understanding of the situation. The famine also highlighted the vulnerabilities of medieval society, especially the ways in which social and political systems were not equipped to respond to such a widespread crisis. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, left peasants at the mercy of the land and their lords. In times of hardship, the poor were the first to suffer, and the wealthy landowners had little incentive to change the system that kept them in power. The growing dissatisfaction with the ruling classes fueled anger among the lower classes, and in some areas, this unrest led to revolts. The strain on the social fabric of society became clear as people who had once been bound to their estates began to question their place in the world. The Great Famine of 1315 was not just a disaster, it was a wake-up call. It exposed the fragile nature of medieval life, where a few bad harvests could lead to widespread catastrophe. It revealed the deep economic divides that existed between different classes and showed how a small change in the environment could cause massive social and political upheaval. The impact of the famine, combined with the existing hardships of the time, would set the stage for even greater challenges in the years that followed. The reverberations of the famine would continue to affect Europe for decades, and its lessons would not be easily forgotten. As we look at the aftermath, we'll see how these events shaped the course of European history and influenced the future of the continent in profound ways. As the Great Famine of 1315 continued to devastate Europe, the social and political consequences of the crisis began to unfold. The strain on the population, combined with the widespread hunger and suffering, began to erode trust in the established systems of power. The Church, which had long been seen as a spiritual and social anchor in European society, found itself facing increasing criticism. Many believe that the famine was a form of divine punishment, and as a result, the church's ability to provide solace to the suffering masses was tested like never before. Despite the church's traditional role as a source of comfort, people began to question its authority and its failure to provide effective aid during such a catastrophic event. The religious explanations for the famine, such as the idea that it was a punishment for sin, did little to alleviate the suffering of the masses. As the famine dragged on, many began to feel that the church was disconnected from their daily struggles. Instead of providing tangible help, the church seemed to focus more on maintaining its power and wealth. This led to widespread disillusionment among the lower classes, who had long looked to the clergy for guidance and support. In some cases, this distrust would fuel the growing dissatisfaction with the existing social order. The nobility, too, found themselves facing increased pressure. Many of the landowners who had relied on agricultural production for their wealth found themselves in financial ruin. Unable to meet their obligations or provide for their peasants, some noble families were forced to sell off land or take on massive debts. The economic instability caused by the famine weakened the foundations of the feudal system, and many peasants began to push for reforms. In some regions, this led to uprisings and revolts as the lower classes sought to hold the nobility accountable for their perceived negligence. These acts of resistance were not always successful, but they revealed the growing divide between the rich and the poor and demonstrated the cracks in the feudal structure that had once been so dominant in Europe. One of the most significant consequences of the Great Famine was its impact on the workforce. As the famine continued, many people were unable to work due to illness or malnutrition. This severely disrupted the agricultural sector, which was heavily dependent on manual labor. Fields went untended, and crops that might have survived the difficult weather conditions were left to rot. This not only exacerbated the food shortage, but also had a ripple effect on other industries that relied on agricultural goods. The shortage of workers in agriculture also meant that wages for those who were still able to work rose, but these higher wages were often not enough to offset the rising cost of living. Those who were employed were often working in appalling conditions, with little protection from the effects of the famine. As a result of the labor shortages, the agricultural system in many parts of Europe began to shift. With fewer peasants available to work the land, some lords turned to more intensive farming techniques or adopted different crops that might be more resilient to the changing climate. However, these efforts were not always successful, and many areas continued to suffer from crop failures. Some regions experienced a shift in the types of crops that were grown, with more emphasis being placed on livestock and dairy farming as a way to diversify the food supply. This shift would have lasting consequences for the agricultural economy, as it set the stage for changes in farming practices that would continue for centuries. The collapse of the agricultural system also had a profound effect on trade. With fewer crops to trade, the movement of goods across Europe slowed to a crawl. The disruptions to transportation networks and the loss of food and raw materials led to the collapse of many local markets. Merchants who had once thrived in the bustling towns found themselves unable to sell their goods, and many traders were forced to abandon their businesses altogether. This economic collapse had a ripple effect on all levels of society, from the poorest laborers to the wealthiest merchants. For many, the famine was a stark reminder of how fragile the medieval economy was and how easily the complex web of trade, labor, and agriculture could unravel. The social unrest caused by the famine and the economic instability it created also had political ramifications. In some regions, the local nobility began to lose control over their subjects, as peasants and workers grew more disillusioned with the existing order. The revolts that broke out in response to food shortages and economic hardship were sometimes brutally suppressed, but they also highlighted the tensions that were simmering just below the surface. In the aftermath of the famine, many rulers realized that they needed to take action to restore order and rebuild the trust of their people. Some turned to new methods of taxation or introduced policies designed to stabilize the economy, while others sought to strengthen their authority through force. The political landscape of Europe was forever changed by the famine, and in some areas, the power of the nobility would never fully recover. The Great Famine's long-lasting impact on Europe would not be fully felt until years later, but it set the stage for many of the challenges that would face the continent in the coming centuries. The environmental changes that triggered the famine were only the beginning. The social, political, and economic consequences of the disaster would continue to ripple through European society for generations to come. The famine exposed the fragility of the medieval world and demonstrated how a combination of climate, social unrest, and economic instability could combine to create a perfect storm of disaster. In the years that followed, Europe would face even greater challenges, including the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. But the lessons learned from the Great Famine of 1315 would never be forgotten. The world would never be the same again. The Great Famine of 1315 marked a turning point in the history of Europe. It not only caused immense suffering, but also set in motion a series of events that would shape the future of the continent. As the famine slowly began to subside, the long-term consequences became clear. The environmental, social, and political upheaval it caused would continue to influence Europe for generations to come. The effects of the disaster would ripple through society, leaving a lasting legacy that would help define the Middle Ages. In the wake of the famine, Europe faced new challenges that only deepened the sense of instability. The loss of life, the economic collapse, and the weakening of the feudal system left the continent vulnerable to further disruptions. For many, the famine had exposed the fragile nature of medieval society and the vulnerability of the people who lived within it. As the population began to recover, Europe's leaders struggled to rebuild and stabilize their kingdoms, but the damage had already been done. Trust in the ruling classes had been shattered, and many people began to question the traditional power structures that had once been so dominant. The church, which had long held a position of authority, found its influence waning. The suffering caused by the famine, combined with the church's failure to offer effective relief, left many people questioning its role in society. Over time, this disillusionment contributed to a rise in skepticism and a challenge to the authority of the clergy. Though the church remained a powerful institution, the seeds of the religious reform movements that would later shake Europe were planted during this period. Politically, the aftermath of the famine saw the rise of new social movements. Peasants and workers who had borne the brunt of the suffering began to demand changes to the existing order. The failure of the feudal system to protect the most vulnerable led to growing unrest, and some regions saw the rise of peasant revolts. While that these uprisings were often brutally suppressed, they signaled a growing desire for change. The old system of land ownership and labor was no longer able to provide the stability it once had. In the years that followed, Europe would experience further upheavals, including the Black Death, which would decimate the population once again. The lessons learned from the Great Famine, however, would remain as a reminder of the fragility of life. Economically, the long-term consequences of the famine were profound. The agricultural system, which had been the backbone of medieval society, was forever changed. The labor shortages and the devastation of crops led to a shift in farming practices, with some regions moving away from traditional crops in favor of livestock and dairy. The collapse of the markets and the disruption of trade routes led to a decline in the prosperity of many regions. Though recovery was possible, it would take years before the economy could regain its previous strength. The economic instability created by the famine also paved the way for future conflicts, including the 100 Years' War, which further strained Europe's resources. As Europe slowly recovered from the famine, the scars left by the disaster remained. The environmental changes that had triggered the crisis were not easily forgotten. The extreme weather events that had caused the crop failures continued to serve as a reminder of how unpredictable nature could be. While some areas rebuilt and regained their former stability, others were left in ruin. The Great Famine had exposed the vulnerability of the medieval world and shown how quickly things could unravel when a crisis struck. The tragedy of the Great Famine of 1315 left an indelible mark on European history. It was a reminder that even in the most prosperous times, society could be brought to its knees by a combination of environmental, social, and economic forces. The lessons learned from this catastrophe would resonate through the centuries, as Europe faced further challenges in the form of war, plague, and political instability. Yet even in the face of such devastation, humanity's ability to rebuild and adapt would remain a constant theme in the centuries to come. As we look back at the events of the Great Famine and its aftermath, we are reminded that history is not just a series of isolated events, but a complex web of interconnected forces that shape our world. The legacy of the Great Famine is a powerful reminder of the fragility of human civilization and the need to understand and learn from our past. The scars left by the famine may have faded, but the lessons of resilience and the importance of unity in the face of adversity remain as relevant today as they were in the early 14th century. The Great Chinese Famine was one of the deadliest disasters in human history. a crisis that unfolded over several years and left millions of people starving. While the famine itself lasted from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, the roots of this disaster ran deeper than just a few years of bad harvests. To fully understand what happened, we need to look at the events leading up to it, the decisions that shaped it, and the devastating impact it had on the people of China. The famine was not just a natural disaster, it was largely man-made. It all began with the Great Leap Forward, a massive campaign launched by Chairman Mao Zedong in the year 1958. The goal was to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. The idea was simple. By collectivizing farms and focusing on large-scale production, China would supposedly be able to produce more food while also increasing steel and industrial output. On paper, this sounded like a bold and ambitious plan, but in reality, it quickly turned into a disaster. One of the most significant changes was the formation of people's communes. These were massive collective farms where private land ownership was abolished, and farmers were forced to work together under government control. The problem was that these communes were not managed efficiently. Farmers were often assigned tasks they had a little experience with, and traditional farming methods were replaced with experimental techniques that did more harm than good. For example, the government promoted a technique called deep plowing, where farmers were instructed to plow deeper into the soil than ever before, believing it would help crops grow better. Instead, it damaged the soil and made it harder for plants to take root. Another issue was close planting, where crops were planted extremely close together under the assumption that it would lead to higher yields. In reality, this caused the plants to compete for nutrients and sunlight, leading to weaker and less productive crops. At the same time, the government insisted on using excessive amounts of fertilizers, many of which were not suitable for the land, further damaging the soil. These policies, combined with unrealistic production targets, led to widespread crop failures. As the situation worsened, local officials felt immense pressure to report success, regardless of reality. Many inflated their production numbers, falsely claiming that record amounts of grain were being harvested. This deception had tragic consequences. Since the central government believed there was a surplus of food, they continued to demand grain from the countryside to supply cities and even export food to other countries. Meanwhile, the rural population who actually grew the food was left with nothing. To make matters worse, nature dealt its own blows. The year 1959 saw severe droughts across major agricultural regions, further reducing crop yields. Then came flooding, which wiped out even more farmland. The combination of misguided policies and natural disasters created the perfect storm for what was about to come. By the end of 1959, food shortages were becoming a reality for millions of people. Farmers who once had control over their own harvests were now entirely dependent on government distribution, and as food supplies dwindled, starvation began to spread. People started to realize that something was terribly wrong, but the government refused to acknowledge the crisis. Propaganda continued to paint an image of success, and any voices of concern were quickly silenced. The stage was set for one of the deadliest famines in history, but at this point, the full extent of the disaster had not yet unfolded. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into how the famine escalated, the desperate measures people took to survive, and the government's response, or lack thereof, as millions began to starve. As the famine worsened in the year 1960, entire communities began to feel the devastating effects of starvation. Food supplies were rapidly diminishing, and for many rural families, the situation became a matter of life and death. Villages that once thrived on agriculture now struggled to find anything edible, and the once hopeful promises of the Great Leap Forward were now seen as empty words. One of the most tragic aspects of the crisis was how the government continued to deny the severity of the situation. Local officials, under immense pressure to show success, kept reporting inflated harvest numbers to higher authorities. These false reports created a deadly cycle. Since the central government believed the countryside had an abundance of food, they continued to take large portions of the harvest for cities, state reserves, and exports. The result was devastating. Rural villages, where the majority of China's population lived, were left with little to nothing to eat. At the same time, strict government policies made it nearly impossible for people to seek food elsewhere. Travel restrictions prevented villagers from leaving their communes to find food in other areas. Those who attempted to leave without permission were often arrested or even executed for defying government orders. The government's grip on information was just as tight. Any discussion of food shortages was seen as a challenge to authority, and those who spoke out were silenced. This created a terrifying situation where people were starving, but the official narrative claimed that everything was improving. Desperation forced people to take extreme measures to survive. Wild plants, tree bark, and even soil became sources of food for those with nothing left. In some cases, villagers dug up old grain husks from the ground, hoping to find any remaining nutrition. Reports from survivors tell of people boiling leather shoes, eating straw, or grinding tree leaves into paste in an effort to stay alive. But these desperate acts were often not enough. Malnutrition spread rapidly, leading to disease, weakness, and death. Adding to the suffering, famine-related diseases began to take hold. When people are severely malnourished, their immune systems weaken, making them more vulnerable to illness. Dysentery, typhoid, and other deadly diseases spread quickly in the weakened population. The lack of proper sanitation and medical care only worsened the crisis. Villages that had once been full of life became eerily quiet, as more and more people succumbed to hunger and disease. Despite the clear signs of a nationwide catastrophe, the government refused to admit the truth. Instead of providing aid, officials doubled down on propaganda, insisting that the famine was either exaggerated or the result of local mismanagement. Some even blamed farmers themselves, accusing them of hoarding food or failing to work hard enough. This denial meant that no real help was given, and millions continued to suffer in silence. By the end of 1960, the death toll had climbed into the tens of millions, but even as entire communities were being wiped out, the worst was still yet to come. In the next part, we'll explore the peak of the famine, the unimaginable lengths people went to in their fight for survival, and how the government's response, or lack of it, sealed the fate of millions. By the year 1961, the Great Chinese Famine had reached its most devastating point. Entire villages had been wiped out, leaving behind abandoned homes, empty fields, and mass graves. The countryside, once filled with hardworking farmers, was now a silent landscape of starvation and suffering. As food supplies ran out completely, people were forced to make impossible choices. In some areas, families resorted to eating clay, sawdust, and even poisonous roots in a desperate attempt to fill their stomachs. Many tried to catch rats, insects, or stray animals, anything that could provide even a small amount of nourishment. But as the famine continued, these sources disappeared as well, leaving people with nothing. Meanwhile, the government's strict control over movement and information only worsened the situation. Farmers were still forbidden from leaving their communes to search for food elsewhere, and the few who attempted to flee were often caught and punished. Many died on the side of roads, their bodies left where they fell, as others were too weak to bury them. The sight of skeletal figures wandering the countryside became tragically common. One of the darkest aspects of the famine was how those in power continued to prioritize politics over human life. Despite millions of deaths, grain exports to other countries continued, and government officials held lavish banquets while their people starved. Farmers, who had once produced food for the entire nation, were now dying in their own fields, surrounded by crops they were not allowed to eat. In urban areas, the effects of the famine were also severe, but city dwellers had slightly more access to government-controlled food supplies. However, rations were barely enough to survive, and only those with political connections or wealth could find additional food on the black market. Even in major cities, reports surfaced of people collapsing from hunger on the streets. As the famine reached its peak, the psychological toll became just as severe as the physical suffering. Families were torn apart as parents struggled to feed their children, and communities that had once relied on cooperation now faced brutal competition for survival. The weight of starvation drove people to desperation, and some were forced to abandon loved ones who could no longer move. Despite the overwhelming evidence of mass starvation, the government refused to acknowledge the full scale of the disaster. Censorship remained strict, and speaking out against the policies that had led to the famine was still considered a crime. Many who dared to criticize the government's handling of the crisis were arrested, silenced, or worse. The truth about what was happening remained hidden from the world and even from many within China itself. But as millions continued to die, cracks began to form in the official narrative. Some local officials, unable to ignore the suffering any longer, started quietly reporting the real conditions in their regions. Behind closed doors, discussions about the famine's true causes and possible solutions began to take place. The leadership was finally being forced to confront the consequences of its policies. In the final part, we'll explore how the famine eventually came to an end, the lasting impact it had on China, and the changes that followed in the years ahead. By the spring of 1962, the Great Chinese Famine had reached its grim climax. The once bustling countryside, home to millions of farmers and their families, had become a land of desolation. Entire villages had been wiped out, and the surviving population was emaciated and broken. The government, which had remained in denial for so long, could no longer ignore the devastating reality. Though the famine was not officially acknowledged until much later, the truth was undeniable. Millions had perished due to a combination of misguided policies, government negligence, and a refusal to adapt to the dire situation. As the famine began to ease, the government finally took some steps to address the crisis. In the wake of mass starvation, the agricultural policies that had caused the disaster were slowly abandoned. The people's communes, which had been central to the Great Leap Forward, were dismantled, and private farming once again became more common. The leadership, recognizing the scale of their failure, began to reverse the collectivization policies that had contributed so heavily to the crisis. But the damage was done. The human toll of the famine was staggering. Estimates of the death toll range widely, but most historians agree that at least 15 million people, and possibly many more, died as a result of the famine. Communities that had once been close-knit and vibrant were shattered, and the psychological scars left by years of suffering would linger for generations. The famine also left a deep and lasting impact on China's political landscape. The disastrous results of the Great Leap Forward severely damaged the credibility of Chairman Mao Zedong and his government. While Mao remained in power for years after the famine ended, the crisis marked the beginning of a slow but steady decline in his authority. His leadership, once seen as infallible, was now questioned by many, though public dissent was still heavily suppressed. Internationally, the famine remained largely hidden from the outside world during its peak. The government's tight control over information meant that the full extent of the crisis was not widely known until years later. In China, the government's official narrative continued to portray the famine as a minor issue, with some even blaming local mismanagement or other scapegoats for the tragedy. It wasn't until the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of China's borders, that more open discussions of the famine began to emerge. Even then, it remained a sensitive and controversial topic, and those who sought to confront the government's role in the disaster often faced harsh consequences. As China moved into the post-famine years, recovery was slow. The scars of the famine ran deep, and many survivors struggled with physical and emotional trauma. The agricultural landscape, once ravaged by years of mismanagement, needed years of work to restore. For the people who lived through the famine, the memories of hunger, loss, and fear remained vivid. While the Great Chinese Famine came to an end, its legacy would continue to shape China's policies and its people for years to come. The disaster had exposed the dangers of central planning and political dogma when combined with the refusal to acknowledge reality. For the survivors, the famine was a reminder of the fragile nature of life in a country where political ideologies often came before human needs. In the years that followed, China would experience rapid economic growth and modernization, but the lessons of the famine remained a somber chapter in its history. The Great Leap Forward had promised progress, but instead brought ruin, and the famine that followed remains one of the darkest periods in modern history. Though time has passed, the memory of the Great Chinese Famine endures as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked government control and the devastating consequences of ignoring human suffering in the pursuit of political goals. The Irish potato famine, also known as the Great Hunger, is one of the most tragic and defining events in Irish history. The famine took place from 1845 to 1852, and it left a permanent mark on the country and its people. It's an event that still gets talked about today, with many people looking back at the impact it had on Ireland's culture, economy, and population. But what exactly happened, and why was this famine so devastating? At its core, the famine was caused by the failure of the potato crop, which was a major food source for the Irish population. The potato had become the staple crop for many Irish peasants, especially in rural areas. It was a cheap and easy crop to grow, and it provided a reliable source of nutrition for families, particularly those living in poverty. However, in 1845, a disease called Phytophthora infestans, also known as potato blight, began to spread across Ireland, wiping out entire crops of potatoes. This blight made the potatoes rot, leaving them inedible and causing an immediate food shortage. The situation quickly worsened, with the blight returning year after year, making it impossible to harvest enough potatoes to feed the population. By 1847, the crisis was in full swing, and famine was widespread. It wasn't just a bad crop failure here and there. The entire food system of Ireland was brought to its knees, but while the cause of the famine seems simple, a failed potato crop, the true reasons behind the tragedy go much deeper, and it's here where we begin to see the full scope of the disaster. The Irish population was already struggling under difficult conditions before the famine hit. Ireland, under British rule at the time, had long been a poor and exploited country. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, which meant they didn't own their land and were at the mercy of landlords who often raised rents. The land was divided into small plots, and these small farmers were forced to rely heavily on a single crop for their survival: the potato. This over-reliance on one crop made the population vulnerable to disaster when that crop failed. But the potato blight wasn't the only factor that made the famine so deadly. The British government's response, or rather lack of response, made the situation even worse. The British authorities at the time believed in a policy called laissez-faire, which essentially meant that they thought the market should take care of things without interference. The idea was that people should be left to fend for themselves, and that the government should not be directly involved in providing aid. This hands-off approach proved to be disastrous, especially in a crisis like the potato famine. The Irish people needed help, but the British government was slow to act. When they did intervene, it was often too little, too late, or poorly executed. British officials focused on sending food exports out of Ireland, believing that they would be more useful to the economy if shipped abroad rather than being used to help the starving population. This policy was met with growing outrage and despair as people continued to starve. As the famine stretched on, the death toll began to rise dramatically. It's estimated that over 1 million people died from hunger, disease, and malnutrition. Thousands more fled Ireland, seeking refuge in other countries, particularly the United States. The mass emigration created a diaspora of Irish people who would carry the memory of the famine with them for generations. The impact was so profound that it reshaped Ireland's demographic makeup, and many Irish families would never return to their homeland. In the midst of this devastation, the Irish people displayed incredible resilience despite the British government's failures. Local communities banded together to provide what little support they could. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and groups organized protests in an attempt to bring attention to the famine's severity. While the government was slow to act, the Irish people's determination to survive and support one another was remarkable. So, what does this all mean? The Irish potato famine was not just a natural disaster caused by a crop failure. It was a tragedy born out of a combination of bad weather, political neglect, and social inequality. It was a moment in history that changed Ireland forever, and its legacy continues to shape the country today. But as we'll see in the next part, the famine was more than just a tragic event. It was also a turning point that would spark change and lead to a rethinking of how governments should respond to disaster and human suffering. Stay tuned as we explore more of the complexities of the Irish potato famine and how its lasting impact continues to echo through history. The Irish potato famine wasn't just a disaster caused by the failure of a single crop. The broader circumstances in Ireland made the famine much worse and helped fuel its devastating consequences. Before the blight ever arrived, Ireland was already struggling under a system of inequality and poverty that made it highly vulnerable to disaster. The impact of the famine was deeply tied to a mix of British colonial policies, the structure of Irish society, and economic pressures that had been building for years. By the time the famine hit, much of the Irish population had already been living in dire conditions. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, meaning they rented their land from landlords rather than owning it. This system left farmers at the mercy of rent demands, and when times were tough, they had little control over their ability to provide for their families. The Irish peasants were heavily reliant on the land for survival, but the small plots of land they worked on made them extremely vulnerable to crop failures. The widespread use of the potato as the main source of food meant that when the crop failed, so did the livelihoods of the people. Over-reliance on the potato wasn't just a cultural choice, it was the result of economic pressures that forced many Irish farmers to rely on a single crop for survival. During the early 1800s, the British government passed a series of laws that severely restricted the rights of Irish tenants. These laws made it harder for Irish farmers to hold on to their land, and forced many to depend on a crop that could be grown quickly and on small plots: the potato. The potato was cheap to grow, nutritious, and could feed entire families, but its widespread use across Ireland made the country highly vulnerable to any problems with the crop. When the potato blight first hit in 1845, it was a major shock, but the true devastation didn't set in until later. The blight wiped out nearly half of Ireland's potato crop in that year alone, but it wasn't just the blight that caused mass starvation. The social and economic structures of Ireland made the problem far worse. Without enough food to feed the population, Irish peasants had few options. Many were already living on the edge with little access to proper nutrition or medical care. With so many people relying on potatoes for their daily diet, there were few alternative food sources when the crop failed. The British government, which ruled over Ireland at the time, didn't seem to fully grasp the scale of the crisis. British officials were primarily concerned with the economy and maintaining control over Ireland, not the well-being of the Irish people. As the famine worsened, the British government was slow to respond. They didn't want to interfere with what they saw as the natural workings of the market, even as millions were starving. This laissez-faire attitude, which means letting things take their course without interference, meant that very little relief was provided to the Irish people. Instead of sending aid, British policies focused on exporting food from Ireland, thinking that keeping the economy going would eventually solve the problem. But this decision only made things worse, as food was being taken from the country while millions of people went hungry. Meanwhile, the British government passed laws like the infamous Gregory Clause, which prohibited relief to anyone who owned more than a quarter of an acre of land. This clause was meant to encourage the poor to leave their farms and seek work elsewhere, but in practice, it left many with a choice between starvation or homelessness. In the face of all this hardship, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves. Despite the lack of government assistance, many communities took matters into their own hands. People organized soup kitchens, helped one another with what little food they had, and worked together to try to survive. There were also protests and demonstrations as the Irish people expressed their anger at the British government's inaction. While many suffered in silence, these acts of defiance showed that the Irish people were far from helpless. They had a fierce determination to survive, even in the worst of circumstances. As the famine stretched on, more and more people died, not just from starvation, but from diseases like typhus and dysentery, which spread quickly in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The death toll is hard to estimate precisely, but it's believed that at least 1 million people died during the famine. In addition to the deaths, millions of others were forced to leave Ireland in search of a better life. The Irish diaspora, particularly to the United States, grew dramatically during and after the famine, as people fled the dire conditions in Ireland. The mass emigration that followed had a lasting impact on Ireland. Entire communities were lost, and the population of Ireland dropped by about a quarter. This also meant that the famine's consequences were felt not just in Ireland, but in the countries where Irish immigrants settled, especially in America. The legacy of the famine shaped the identity of the Irish people for generations, influencing both the Irish who remained in Ireland and those who started new lives in foreign lands. So what was the impact of all this? The Irish potato famine was not just a food crisis, it was a turning point in Ireland's history. The failure of the British government to provide meaningful assistance during this crisis led to deep resentment and anger toward the British. Many Irish people began to see the famine as a direct result of British colonialism and policies that treated the Irish as second-class citizens. This anger would eventually lead to a push for independence and reform in the following decades. The potato famine, while a tragedy, also played a key role in shaping Ireland's path to the modern era. As we continue to explore the deeper complexities of the famine, we can start to see the long-lasting effects it had on both Ireland and its people. It wasn't just a period of loss, but one of profound change. Stay tuned on Dale with the next part of this story, where we will look at how the British government's policies and the Irish response to the famine set the stage for the future. As the famine deepened, the effects of British policies became even more apparent. The British government's response, or lack of it, was one of the most controversial aspects of the potato famine. While the Irish population struggled to survive, the British government continued to follow a policy of non-intervention, under the belief that market forces would eventually balance things out. But this idea, which worked in some situations, was disastrous when applied to the desperate conditions in Ireland. The British approach ignored the scale of the crisis, the unique situation in Ireland, and the human suffering that was taking place, The economic theory of laissez-faire, which believed in minimal government involvement, was ill-suited to handle such a catastrophic event. At the heart of this failure was a series of decisions that prioritized economic interest over human lives. One of the most glaring examples of this was the continued export of food from Ireland during the famine. Even though millions of people were starving, Ireland's ports were still exporting grain, meat, and other essential foodstuffs to Britain and other countries. This was driven by the British government's economic policies, which prioritized keeping trade flowing and maintaining the stability of the market. While Irish people were dying from hunger, their own resources were being shipped abroad. To make matters worse, when relief efforts were provided, they were either too little or too late and often poorly managed. The British government set up workhouses where the Irish could go for food and shelter, but these were overcrowded and poorly maintained, and many people were turned away. The workhouse conditions were so bad that many would rather risk starvation than enter them. Public works projects were also introduced, but these too failed to alleviate the suffering. While some infrastructure was built, the projects were insufficient to meet the needs of the population, and the workers were often paid poorly, which made it hard for them to support their families. British relief efforts were slow, ineffective, and often seen as an afterthought rather than a true attempt to save lives. The British government also imposed policies that were seen as punitive rather than helpful. One of the most infamous examples of this was the introduction of the Gregory Clause in 1847. This clause, named after Sir William Gregory, a British politician, stated that only those who owned less than a quarter of an acre of land were eligible for relief. The idea was to encourage people to leave their land and go to the cities to find work, but in practice, this policy devastated the Irish poor, forcing many of them to choose between starvation or giving up their homes. It was a clear example of how the British government's response was more concerned with maintaining social control than with alleviating the suffering of the Irish people. Meanwhile, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves, and they responded in ways that showed both their resilience and frustration. As the government failed to act, communities began to organize their own relief efforts. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and people worked together to support one another. In many areas, the Irish created their own forms of resistance, including protests and demonstrations, to demand better treatment from the British authorities. Though these actions were often small and localized, they demonstrated the defiance and strength of the Irish people. They refused to accept the status quo, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. But even with the best efforts of the Irish people, the famine continued to rage. Over the course of the famine, it's estimated that 1 million people died from hunger and disease. Another million were forced to emigrate, mainly to the United States, where Irish immigrants began to form a significant part of the population. The Irish diaspora, which had been growing steadily, swelled dramatically during and after the famine. Many of those who survived found themselves starting over in foreign lands, leaving behind the poverty and despair that had gripped their homeland. The emigration caused by the famine had lasting effects on both Ireland and the countries that received the Irish immigrants. In Ireland, the population dropped by nearly a quarter, and entire communities were lost. Those who stayed behind were left with the memory of the tragedy and the resentment toward the British government that would continue for decades. For the Irish immigrants, the famine was a defining moment. It shaped their identity and played a role in the rise of Irish nationalism, particularly in the United States. The Irish, who had once been seen as an underclass in their homeland, now began to rise in prominence in their new communities, fueled by the trauma of the famine and their desire for a better life. The Irish potato famine was not just a food crisis, it was also a political and social crisis. It exposed the deep inequalities that existed in Ireland and the callousness of British policies toward the Irish people. It showed how British colonialism, combined with the lack of effective government response, could lead to catastrophic consequences. And it revealed the strength and determination of the Irish people, who refused to accept their fate and found ways to survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. By the time the famine began to subside in 1852, its effects were already felt far and wide. The social, political, and cultural landscape of Ireland had been forever altered. The famine had not only caused immense human suffering, but it also ignited a spark of resistance that would continue to burn in Ireland for years to come. As we look at the aftermath of the famine and its lasting impact on Irish society, we can begin to understand why this event is still so deeply felt today. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where we will examine the long-term effects of the famine on both Ireland and the world. As the years passed after the Irish potato famine, the long-term effects of the tragedy continued to shape both Ireland and the broader world. The loss of nearly a quarter of the Irish population, both in death and emigration, left Ireland in a state of deep social and economic upheaval. Entire communities had been wiped out, and those who remained were often traumatized by the horrific events they had witnessed. The famine's aftermath was not just about dealing with immediate starvation and poverty. It was about the profound psychological scars it left on the Irish people and their sense of identity. One of the most significant effects of the famine was the mass emigration of the Irish population, particularly to the United States. An estimated 1 million Irish men, women, and children left Ireland during and after the famine, seeking a better life across the Atlantic. This migration was not just a flight from hunger, it was a desperate attempt to escape the economic and political circumstances that had contributed to the famine in the first place. The Irish, who left behind their homeland, found themselves in a strange new world, where they faced their own set of challenges, but also the possibility of a fresh start. In the United States, Irish immigrants were often met with hostility and discrimination, as many Americans viewed them as a poor, uneducated, and undesirable group. However, over time, the Irish immigrants would prove themselves to be resilient and hardworking, slowly carving out a place for themselves in American society. They became an important part of the labor force, particularly in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where they worked in factories, on railroads, and in construction. The Irish also began to build their own communities, churches, and institutions, creating a strong cultural identity that was rooted in their experiences of hardship and survival. This massive wave of immigration would also have significant effects on the political landscape of the United States. The Irish immigrants, many of whom were poor and working class, found a voice in the country's burgeoning labor movement. They played an instrumental role in pushing for better working conditions, higher wages, and the right to form unions. The Irish also became increasingly involved in politics, with Irish Americans eventually rising to power in major cities and even in the US Congress. This political influence would continue to grow throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Irish Americans became a formidable political force in the United States. Back in Ireland, the effects of the famine were no less profound. The population had been decimated, and the country's rural economy was in shambles. The devastation caused by the failure of the potato crop, coupled with the economic policies of the British government, had left the Irish people with little means of recovery. The lack of investment in the country's infrastructure and the British government's continued neglect only exacerbated the situation. Despite the aid provided by Irish communities and immigrants abroad, recovery was slow. The land itself had been severely damaged by years of over-reliance on the potato, and many farmers were unable to rebuild their livelihoods. The famine also brought to the forefront the deep political and social divisions between the Irish people and the British government. The anger and resentment toward British policies that had fueled the famine never fully dissipated. In fact, the famine became a rallying point for Irish nationalism. Many Irish began to view the famine as a clear example of British neglect and oppression, and it strengthened calls for Irish independence. The memory of the famine would continue to fuel political movements in Ireland for decades, and it played a significant role in the push for home rule and eventually full independence. In the decades following the famine, the Irish people began to rebuild their communities and their country. Despite the devastating loss of life and the trauma left by the famine, the Irish displayed remarkable resilience. They sought to preserve their culture, language, and traditions, even as they faced tremendous odds. The Irish language, which had been in decline for years, experienced a revival as a symbol of national pride and resistance to British control. Cultural institutions, such as theaters, museums, and schools, were founded to promote Irish identity and history. In the global context, the Irish potato famine also had far-reaching effects. It is often seen as a catalyst for broader social and political movements, particularly in relation to food security and the rights of colonized peoples. The famine highlighted the dangers of monoculture farming, the over-reliance on a single crop, and the vulnerabilities of agricultural societies. It also exposed the risks of unchecked market policies and the devastating impact they can have on vulnerable populations. The global awareness of the Irish tragedy led to increased activism for food aid and social justice, as well as growing support for movements that sought to protect the rights of the impoverished and disenfranchised. Over time, the Irish potato famine became a symbol of survival and struggle. It was a defining moment in Irish history that continued to shape the country's political, social, and cultural landscape. The famine not only reshaped the lives of those who lived through it, but also left a legacy of activism and resistance that would echo throughout generations. As we reflect on the effects of the famine, we begin to see how such tragedies can spark change, giving rise to new ideas and movements that push for justice and equality. In the next part of this story, we will explore how the famine continues to impact Irish identity and global memory, and how its legacy is still felt today. As we reach the final part of this story, it's important to reflect on the long-lasting impact of the Irish potato famine and how it continues to shape Ireland and its people today. The Great Hunger, as it's often called, remains one of the darkest chapters in Irish history, and its repercussions can still be felt across the world. The famine was not just a devastating loss of life, it was a pivotal moment that changed the course of history in Ireland, influenced the global political landscape, and left an imprint on generations of Irish people, both in Ireland and abroad. One of the most profound ways the famine has shaped Irish identity is through the deep sense of loss and survival that remains at the core of the national consciousness. For many Irish people, the memory of the famine is not just about the tragedy of those years, but about the strength and resilience of those who endured it. Even as the famine devastated Ireland, it also created a new sense of unity among the Irish people, one that transcended geographical boundaries. The shared experience of suffering and loss became a bond that would last for generations, uniting the Irish diaspora around the world. This sense of solidarity can still be seen today, especially in the way the Irish community comes together to remember the victims of the famine. Every year, on the anniversary of the famine's peak, Irish people hold memorials and events to honor those who perished and to reflect on the ongoing struggles faced by marginalized communities. These events serve as a reminder of the resilience of the Irish people, and they continue to foster a deep sense of pride in the country's history, culture, and ability to overcome adversity. The legacy of the famine also extends to the political and social movements that it inspired, particularly in Ireland's fight for independence. The trauma of the famine played a significant role in the rise of Irish nationalism, as many began to view British colonial rule as the cause of their suffering. This sentiment fueled the demand for Irish self-rule and eventually led to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. The Irish nationalist movement, which gained momentum after the famine, would go on to shape the political landscape of Ireland for much of the 20th century. In addition to its role in fostering Irish nationalism, the famine also had a lasting effect on the global awareness of food security, colonial exploitation, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. The Irish potato famine highlighted the dangers of food dependency and the devastating consequences of market-driven policies that put profits before people's well-being. It also shone a spotlight on the effects of British imperialism, which had already been a point of contention for many colonized nations. The world began to take a closer look at the treatment of impoverished populations, and the tragedy of the famine led to increased advocacy for social justice, humanitarian aid, and more equitable agricultural practices. While the Irish potato famine may have been a disaster of incomprehensible scale, it also acted as a catalyst for change on both a national and global level. The lessons learned from this dark chapter in history continue to influence policies on food security, the rights of the oppressed, and the importance of government responsibility in times of crisis. Today, as we reflect on the famine, we are reminded of how human-made tragedies can be caused by a mix of greed, neglect, and inequality, and how those tragedies, though painful, can also spark movements that fight for justice and human dignity. In Ireland, the memory of the potato famine continues to be a symbol of perseverance and hope. It reminds the Irish people, and indeed the world, that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there is always the possibility for renewal and change. The famine, with all its devastation, laid the groundwork for a stronger, more independent nation and a more engaged and compassionate global community. Through the pain and the loss, Ireland found a renewed sense of purpose and identity, one that would go on to shape the country's future and its place in the world. As we conclude this story, we can't help but see the Irish potato famine as more than just a tragic event. It is a story of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. The famine not only shaped the course of Irish history, but it also shaped the world's understanding of hunger, colonization, and the need for social change. And in the end, it serves as a powerful reminder of the ways in which even the darkest moments can lead to brighter futures. Thank you for taking this journey through history with me, and I hope this story has given you a deeper understanding of one of the most devastating yet transformative events in Irish history.